Hey, what's up, everybody? Welcome back to News Toast. And we are on the cusp of a Switch 2 reveal. We've seen the rumors, we've seen the leaks, everything is leaking out right now. And what's more is that we may have just gotten information about its release and its reveal windows. So if you're as excited about the Switch 2 as I am, then stick around and we're going to talk about all of that today. Now, we also got some news from Valve that might also have Microsoft and Xbox on their heels a little bit because the competition just got that much more difficult for their future plans, or at least based off of what we've been hearing, unless they have something up their sleeves as well, which I do expect to be the case. Let's just go get right into things, though, starting off with a brand new controller for Xbox, but maybe for consumers that prefers the PlayStation 5 controller. This comes from Hyperkin, and you can see it here. They're calling this the competitor, and it's fairly easy to see why. It's familiar, if anything else. And if you look at the PlayStation 5 DualSense, it almost aligns with how that controller is laid out perfectly. Now, unfortunately, it doesn't have the feature that makes the DualSense special in the first place, being its haptic feedback. But outside of that, it has a similar theme in colors, the D-pad looks similar, it has identical triggers, and they even replicated the symmetrical design of the analog sticks that PlayStation is just so well known for. Now, it is a wired controller though, which will limit its audience a little bit, but it does have Hall effect joysticks, which is nice because, you don't have to worry as much about stick drift. What I'll kind of say here, though, is that I do like what Hyperkin is doing. I'm not necessarily expecting this to be a big-time seller or anything like that, but more options for consumers, I view that as a great thing. So for anybody who has multiple platforms, if you do prefer the layout of the DualSense controller more, well, then this might be a nice option, but they've yet to give us a release date or price, so some of it will kind of depend on that as well. Now, speaking of Sony, they were at CES yesterday, and they did technically reveal some information that gamers will be interested in. It appears they are going to fully commit to transmedia, or in other words, they're going to utilize their gaming-related IP, and they're going to adapt them to shows and movies. Now, this is something that we've been seeing a lot in the gaming space these past few years, and that's because, when done right, it can spike interest for their games, or vice versa. We've seen that with The Witcher, we've seen it with Sonic, Mario, Cyberpunk 2077, and even for The Last of Us. So with that in mind, Sony's going all in with multiple announcements. Ghost of Tsushima Legends is getting an anime adaptation. I do find it interesting that they went with Legends specifically. I want to see exactly what that means. Helldivers is also going to get a film adaptation. I'm assuming that that will be a comedic popcorn flick. It's definitely an interesting choice, but it is another shining example of its importance to Sony and just how they view this franchise. And the same can be said about Horizon Zero Dawn. Sony thinks a lot of this specific franchise, to say the least. It's showing up everywhere. It has its own games. It's on VR. It has its own movie coming up. They made a Lego game. They're doing a lot with the Horizon IP. It's now going to get a major motion picture. Allegedly, they even have an MMO in development. I do like the world of Horizon. I don't know if Aloy as a character is super interesting, and that's something that you might need for a film, but it could be a cool world to bring to life in a similar way to how audiences were captivated by Avatar. Then lastly, The Last of Us 2 got a new trailer and a release date for April. Now, admittedly, I'm not a huge fan of the first season of The Last of Us. Personally, I thought the game was far better, and I wasn't exactly sold on all of the changes that they made for the show. I thought the first episode was really good. I thought it was a great start, but after that, I just feel like the game is much better. That's just my opinion, because at the same time here, I know a lot of people just absolutely adored the first season, and if anything else, it'll be interesting to see how Season 2 is received from fans who aren't familiar with the games. A lot of people who are watching the show have not played the games. So obviously, Part 2 is controversial, and we'll see how this different audience views the same events and how they're portrayed in the show. Let me know, though, are you interested in any of these adaptations? And if you had to vote, what's an adaptation that you would like to see from Sony in the future? All right, so let's go and get into the big news here, because Mario, once again, he is just not doing his job. I've been hearing that Nintendo is seriously considering the unemployment line for him because he has just become a failure of a plumber. I mean, he's great at games, don't get me wrong. Absolutely fantastic games. They'll keep him for that. But just a failure when it comes to being a plumber. Just everything is leaking for the Nintendo Switch 2, and that now includes a possible reveal and a release window. Now, there's actually two different leaks here that points to the same thing. We'll first start off with Next Handheld. This is the leaker from over on Reddit that leaked out images of the Switch 2. So check this back and forth out with him responding to a question. This image was posted up online, and he was asked, Next Handheld, people are going crazy in the Switch 2 subreddit. Surely you know when the thing is getting revealed, right? And then Next Handheld responded, I've just heard January announcement and both March and April for launch. More based on supply chain and distributors' secondhand info, though. So he was upfront about this being secondhand information, and that means I would definitely take this with a grain of salt. But where things get really interesting is that was the only leak that claimed an April launch. You can see here posted up by Wario64, he said, Genki, who makes gaming accessories for the Switch and other hardware, claims that the Switch 2 will launch in April. It also claims that their Switch 2 mockup is based on a real Switch 2, and they also said that the optical sensor on the Joy-Con is a new feature of the Switch 2, but doesn't know what the C button is for. So here we have multiple different leaks claiming the same thing, an April launch. I'd say at the very least here, I think that this adds credence to the idea that the Switch 2 will launch within the first 6 months of 2025. There has been speculation of whether or not they would do it in the first half of the year or the second half, and this does add credence to the idea that it could release sooner rather than later. Now, as for a January announcement, though, that's potentially very exciting as well. I mean, with all of the leaks going around right now, I think it's better for Nintendo to do it sooner rather than later. That way they can kind of control the narrative themselves. Otherwise, they could risk an even more significant leak, such as gameplay for maybe backwards compatible games or something like that. Either which way, though, I mean, I seriously could not be more excited about the Switch 2, and it seems like it's finally happening. An announcement and a release date seems to be right around the corner. It could be announced as early as this month, and it could even release within just a few months from now, or at least according to this rumor. Now, there was also another major story that came out of CES, but this involves Valve, Lenovo, and to some extent, Microsoft and Xbox. I'll come back to that here in just a moment. But what's happening here is that Lenovo revealed the previously leaked Legion Go 2 and the Legion Go S. Now, the Legion Go 2 is going to be the more premium option of the two with an 8.8-inch OLED display with VRR capability. This is the exact successor that fans requested, but yeah, it's going to come in at a high price. Now, they've yet to announce its price or its release date, but I'm expecting it to be every bit as high as it is premium. We're probably looking at a close to $800 to maybe even $1,000. The more interesting announcement here, though, was the Legion Go S, and that's because there's actually going to be two different options. The Windows-based model, which will ship out this month for $730, or if you want to wait, they also have a Steam OS option planned for May at just $500. Now, from my understanding, the Windows option will have 32 gigabytes of RAM, whereas the Steam OS model will have 16 gigabytes. But the reason that all of this is just so significant is because Valve is now ready to license out their Steam OS. What this does is that this opens up the door for any amount of third-party company to create their own variant of the Steam Deck. Now, personally, I love my Steam Deck OLED. It's actually one of my most played platforms since I purchased it. But now there's going to be a lot more options, which that's great for consumers. That means that third-party companies could introduce more price points to really niche down on each individual consumer and what they want out of a device like this. Instead of waiting for the eventual Steam Deck 2, well, now consumers will have the option to get one of these third-party consoles that could potentially be even more powerful than what the current Steam Deck has to offer. Now, that might impact the Steam Deck and just how many units it sells, but honestly, I don't think Valve is overly concerned about that even in the slightest. I mean, they make most of their money on their storefront anyways, and this only brings even more consumers over to Steam. In fact, this is actually a very similar strategy that we've been hearing about Xbox and their possible Xbox OS and what they're working on. We've heard multiple times throughout 2024 that Microsoft is working on a plan to license out the Xbox OS to third-party manufacturers like Lenovo and ROG. So it's almost like Microsoft and Valve are kind of heading towards a collision course in the handheld and maybe even the PC space. On one corner, you have Valve with their SteamOS that uses Linux, and then on the opposite corner, you have Microsoft with their potential Xbox OS that uses Windows. I mean, this could actually be very exciting if all of this actually happens, and it could actually be a huge part of the future. I mean, I've mentioned it before, but I think handhelds are going to be one of the most lucrative growing businesses in the gaming space over the next 5 or so years. And based on some of the information that we've been hearing, it might not be all that long before we have a legitimate competition between SteamOS and Xbox OS. At the very least, right now we have SteamOS versus these Windows handhelds, but I think that's just another reason that Microsoft's going to come in and try to improve it with a potential Xbox OS. And, this doesn't just include handhelds either, but also for computers. We very well could see an Xbox PCS console in the future and the return of Steam machines. And I say all of this just to kind of highlight, I think Valve and Xbox's strategy is much more similar than what people even realize. We always look at Xbox versus PlayStation. Those are the two big competitors. But it looks like Xbox's plans kind of aligns more with Valve than it does PlayStation. Valve's current strategy is almost a crystal ball for what we could potentially see from Xbox here in just the next few years. Either which way, though, I really like what Valve is doing here, and this gives consumers an even better opportunity to jump into one of the best ecosystems in all of gaming, being Steam. Anyways, though, that's going to be it for this episode, but until next time, make sure to subscribe, ring that bell, and peace out.